compression and expansion. What do they sound like? How can you use them to get what effects, etc. So let's go. Here we are in Ableton Live, and I have a drum break. So I'm gonna change the tempo, and I'm just gonna really quickly make something out of this. So I'll start with that. I'm just gonna adjust the tempo so that that lands on the 3. Yeah, how about like that? So I'll just go through here and quickly make some crossfades so that we don't have any pops and clicks. So I chose this drum break because it had a good amount of noise floor to it. Because that's the first thing I'm going to show you, and because this is a raw drum break, I think it'll be pretty easy to tell what the multiband compressor is doing. So I'll get out a Pro MB, and I'll also get a Pro Q, because Pro Q is actually also a compressor. It's not just an EQ. It's a dynamic EQ, which means it has an envelope follower, so it's like a simple compressor. You can't really set very you can't have as many settings on the compression as you can with like the Pro MB, but you can have much more fine control over the region. So if you drag down this dynamic thing and then open up this little auto section, you can turn the sidechain on, so you can have it sidechain to something else, and you can also adjust this threshold, and this threshold will influence kind of how much compression you're getting and when you're getting it. But first I'll start with the Pro MB because it's a little bit easier to understand. And actually get a Pro C first, just to show you what's going on with a normal compressor. So I'll turn off these first two, and I'm just gonna start to compress the signal and try to listen to what's happening to the snappiness and the length of the hits and the noise floor and the overall loudness. So what I did there was I first used the compressor to kind of accentuate the noise floor and diminish the dynamic range. And then I made the attack long instead of short and the release short instead of long to get a more snappy feel out of those drums while still increasing the overall perceived loudness. This ratio is kind of like almost like an amount. These two together, the threshold and the ratio, are how you get the amount of compression you're applying. And then you're always going to want to increase the output gain because a compressor is turning things down. And the attack and release is how long it takes to turn things down and how long it takes for the things to come back up to the volume above the threshold. So now that you hear that, let me show you some cool things about Pro MB, because Pro C is just a compressor. There's no expansion going on. And expansion is really useful, especially with these kind of break beats or anything really. You can use it on vocals to get some good effects too. So I'll show you some compression on the multiband level, and then I'll show you some expansion as well. So this first compression, this compressor, I'm pretty sure this only does downward compression. There's these different styles, which is cool, and those have a different quality. There is a sidechain that you can set here, so you can use this to sidechain compress. And that's about it. So with this Pro MB, you can use it as a single band compressor by just making one band, and then you can set it to sidechain as well. You can also set it to expand or compress. And if you look at the range here, the range goes above this line, which is the output gain, and below it. So when you set the line above, it turns it into upwards compression instead of typical downwards compression. So first I'll show you the difference between like upwards and downwards compression on the drum break. So you can see it's taking the louder parts of the signal and turning them way down, and therefore once I boost the output here, I'm basically turning up all the quieter stuff like that snare tail and whatnot. Now I'll show you upwards compression. Oh, first downwards compression I'll just review. That's with a short attack and medium short release. You want to adjust your release depending on how fast those transients are happening and whatever audio you're working with. And so that's if I want to diminish the dynamic range. If I want to accentuate the dynamic range and make it more punchy and less kind of noisy, I can increase this attack. So another thing you're going to see on a lot of compressors is this knee. And this knee is really easy to see. Oops, I had been applying double compression here on the Pro C. I'll turn that off. But you can see the knee here is shown by this curve. So the ratio is shown here. So 1-to-1 ratio is a linear transfer curve. And as I increase the ratio, it becomes more dramatic. And then as I adjust this knee, you can see it's more or less smooth, the transition between the regular transfer curve of volume over time and this compression being applied. So basically you can hear that as more or less jerkiness. It'll be more or less jerky. So if I turn the knee up, it'll be kind of less jerky. Okay, so now that that makes sense, I will show you upwards compression. So you can see it kind of stopped working. With the Pro MB, you want to keep attention on this yellow line and look at how it's moving. See how it's just stuck? That's because I need to adjust this threshold to be more at the top. So watch as I push the threshold up. So you can see it now with a longer attack time, it's kind of pushing those loud parts even louder. So that is very useful. And then we can do expansion. And expansion is a type of compression. So first we'll do downward expansion. So see, with downward expansion, I was able to remove a lot of that noise floor. And that's being done with a very short attack and a pretty short release, and the threshold set all the way up. So every time that gain leaves this threshold, it's going to activate this little release. And then as I increase the attack, I can kind of start to take off the beginning of those transients. So that's with single band, right? But we're in Pro MB, so we can do multi-band. So now how would I like to treat this drum rack? Well, there's a lot, or this drum groove, this drum loop. Well, for me personally, I think it could use like a little bit more sub. So I could use this kind of like an EQ and just turn the sub up. And then what type of compression would I like to use? Well, maybe I like that downward expansion. I don't necessarily want to keep the sub louder for longer. I might actually want to make it even more snappy and less roomy. So maybe I do a similar thing like we were just doing with no attack, a little bit of release, mid-range on the ratio, and a full threshold. So that sounds a little bit warmer. Now let's kind of find that snare transient. So you can see there with a bit of upwards compression, low attack and low release. With the threshold set properly, I was able to get a little bit more snap. Maybe I can work on it a little more. I'm sorry, that's set to expansion. Let's try compression. So there with a little, with a pretty long attack and a short release, I'm getting a little bit more snappiness, but let's go back to the expansion because that was sounding pretty good. So a little bit of expansion there, short attack and release, just taking those punchy bits and making them a little more punchy. And now maybe maybe I like to actually accentuate the noise floor. So a bit more upwards expansion on the highs, but instead of making them more punchy, I could keep them louder for longer and kind of bring up that noise floor. So you can hear with a longer release there and a longer attack, same kind of compression as here in the mids, but longer release and attack and a bit more ratio. I'm able to keep that fuzzy, staticky thing to hold on for a bit longer. So let's keep going and let's work on these other regions now. This low mids region, this is where a lot of mud happens. So let's see if we can make that sound a bit better. So got a little bit more snappiness out of it, a little bit more punchiness out of it, a little bit more fullness out of it, but yeah, and a little more pumping. I'm increasing the pumping on basically all this stuff. So now let's work on this upper mids region. And here's another trick with the Pro MB. If you hover over these split points and you scroll, you can adjust the Q of the filter cutoff and kind of gradiate or blend into each form of compression per band, so you can have it kind of smoothly transfer between them. So you can isolate each type of compression more or less by doing that. So with some tight downwards expansion on this upper mids region, I was able to kind of get more transient and punch out of that upper snare area and kick area and reduce the reverbiness a little bit while keeping that nice static noise up on the top end. So you can see how multi-band compressors, especially the Pro MB, they really let you customize the character of the dynamic of whatever signal you're working with. And it's this same basic process of trying the different types of expansion and compression per band, and just trying each one out and adjusting the attack release, all these parameters right here. So then to get a bit more quality, because this compression can be pretty mathematically intense, if you want a cleaner result, you can go down here to this oversampling and turn on the oversampling. So whenever you're splitting frequencies with filters like this, it creates a bit of little bit of smearing of the phase. So how to fix that in the Pro MB is you can change it from dynamic phase to linear phase, and that can help sometimes. And whenever you're doing compression in Ableton or whatever DAW, it really helps to put a utility before the compressor and then do some of the work with actual volume automation. So I think this first kick could be louder at the start, and then I could actually draw in some of my own kind of manual compression. And this is a really useful trick for working with vocals. It's just going into each of the syllables or each of the points and manually drawing in some gain. So I think that's sounding more cleaner and nicely leveled and less like a raw drum break. So let's sample this out and just look at the difference. All right, so let's compare these two. So I'm going to turn them down a smidge because they definitely got a lot louder. So we want to kind of try to gain match that a bit. So let's look at the difference in these two. So you can see if you look between the hits, there's less noise floor. So I'm really turning down the noise floor and getting a little bit more punch. But you can see I'm actually making some of these sounds a little less dynamic, kind of relaxing the transients a little bit. See there, the transients are getting a little bit more relaxed. So if you want to get a little bit more transient back, here's where I like to use Pro Q because you can be a little bit more surgical. So let's use a little bit of Pro Q compression. So I think this area around 750 hertz would be good. I'll go in here and get a steeper Q, like a 36, and then I'll just decrease the gain here and start turning up the dynamic, and I can get a little bit more punch out of it. So because I diminished that noise floor, the overall drum break sounds a bit quieter overall. So now I can use a limiter, which is like a cleaner kind of compressor, and I can just limit this a bit, and I think that might help. So on a lot of compressors, you're going to see this look-ahead feature, and what this look-ahead feature is it adds latency to the overall project to give this plugin more time to analyze the signal before it treats it with the compression. So that's how you get a cleaner compression effect with less artifacts from the compression, less ugly pumping and distortion. So the more you turn this look-ahead up, the more you're going to hear it cleaner. So if I turn this down, listen to what happens. So you can see when I turned that look-ahead up, it really cleaned it up. And then to clean it up even more, I'll turn on the oversampling. So now I could sample that. And let's look at it now. So first I reduced the noise floor and made everything a little bit more snappy, and then I limited the whole thing to kind of increase that noise floor again, but it helps you kind of keep that snappiness still. So now there's our limited drum break. So you can see that now we're nice and leveled out. All the drum hits are more of the same kind of level. And we got a little bit of transient back. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. These kicks are kind of sad. So one thing we can do to make these kicks a little bit happier is we can cut them off the zero crossing, and then they'll have a little pop. It's kind of an unconventional approach, but hey, we're making electronic music here, so so here we can come in and cut these off the zero crossing so that there's like a little DC offset pop at the beginning. So however far off you go on the DC offset, the more pop you're going to get. So if I do a little bit less, we'll have less of a pop. So that's up to your own taste, whether you like that or not. Another thing we can do is just warp this to be more on beat. And if you don't like the way that digital click sounds, you can use something else, like a different drum break. Or maybe just an electronic kick with a nice click, or like a Foley sample. Let's look for a Foley sample. Something with like some nice highs, like a crack. I actually have a group of clicks. I have a whole folder full of random clicks. Yeah, I wanted like a single click. Let's use this Mr. Bill click. So I could just take this and maybe turn it down a bit. And we could try this instead. So that's sounding like a pretty good drum break now. So let's listen to the original drum break again without any compression or any of this stuff. So this is what it sounded like before. Oh, I'm sorry, let's solo it. Sounds very live, but it also sounds pretty lo-fi and shitty. And then here's our compressed and more quantized version. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good improvement. I hope that explains kind of how you can use compression and expansion. And this same process works on vocals, just slightly differently, but same kind of approach. Bass lines that have more dynamics in them. You can use this to get things louder or to make things more punchy. That's kind of the basic idea behind compression, is like, do I want it to get it sounding louder and less punchy, or do I want it to sound more punchy, more snappy? You know, you can make things sound more snappy and less punchy, or more punchy and less snappy, or more punchy and snappy. You can make things sound more full, bringing up that noise floor. So yeah, use ProMB. It's an incredible plugin, highly recommend it. Same with all the Fabfilter plugins. They're just incredible plugins. But you can do all this stuff in Ableton. There's a multi-band compressor. It gives you 3 bands. So that's pretty good too. If you don't have that, just learn how to use the Ableton one. The Ableton one's a little confusing because there's not this nice visual readout of the frequency spectrum. It's like just these 3 bars and the arbitrary numbers that are like, here's where the cutoffs are. So it can be a little bit more confusing and a lot more tempting to just not use it because it's a little bit more techie looking. But yeah, there's all kinds of cool multi-band plugins out there, and the more I find I use multi-band compression and just multi-band plugins in general, the more I realize that it's really useful to be able to hone in on specific parts of the frequency. But remember that whenever you're splitting frequencies, you're creating phasing. So it's a good practice if you don't have a lot of CPU at your disposal, if you're just on a MacBook or something, it's a good practice to crank up that oversampling, switch it to linear phase, listen, see if it sounds better, turn up that look ahead, and then just render it out. And then you can turn the plugins off so they won't use as much CPU, and then just listen to the rendered one in your track, and you can always go back to that old channel and tweak the settings and then render it out again if you want. So that's how you're going to keep things clean when you're using multiband splitting and multiband effects. So definitely try to do that. Unless you're really going for that phasey sound, sometimes that's nice. So try that too. Go crazy. See what happens when you stack like 6 or 7 of these and push the ratio all the way up, bring the threshold all the way down. Do some radical stuff with it, because that's where you're going to really start to hear what it's doing, and you might get some cool results that way. 3 multiband compressors doing wild settings going into a limiter might sound really cool. So don't think that you need to approach this like a surgeon. It can be a really great creative tool as well. So I just tried to show you the more surgical approach here on this drum break, just because I feel like that's an important thing to understand. But maybe I'll do a future video where I'm abusing multiband plugins, multiband compression to get some interesting results. So yeah, until next time, I'm Sephiros. I hope you learned something. I hope you have a great rest of your day or night. And yeah, big up. Peace.